I'm just going to say it's lonely up here. I'm the only person on this floor in this office today. No Sally, no Lynn. I'm lonely.
Make some noise.
We're here with you in spirit, Commissioner. I'm on the second floor, so.
Well, I'm waving to you, Dustin.
All right, everyone. This is Chair French convening the regular business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for Thursday, August 15th, 2024. On today's agenda, we have 22 consent agenda items, we have 3 noticed items, and we have 1 discussion item, which is our quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities. We would normally begin with our consent agenda, but I'm going to start with 1 quick announcement, because if I wait till the end of this meeting, I will forget to make it. And that is that we will not be having a business meeting next Tuesday, the 20th. We've got at least a couple commissioners that are traveling that day, and so there will be no business meeting on the 20th. So now we can move to our first item on our agenda, which is consideration of the consent agenda. Commissioners, you've had the opportunity to review the 22 items on the consent agenda. Let me ask at this time if there are any questions, beginning with Commissioner Keither.
No, thank you.
And Commissioner Keen. Commissioner, you are on mute if you are speaking to us.
Yeah, me speaking to myself. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I had a little interference in the background, so I'm getting my train of thought back again. I have no questions either. My intention is to recuse from consent agenda item number 2. Acknowledging that, I would move approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda, noting Commissioner Keen's recusal on item number 2. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The consent agenda is approved. We will now move to our noticed items. Our first noticed item is a proposed order in docket number 24 WCNE 235 GIE, and our presenter for this item is Mr. Brian Fedotin. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, Commissioners. On September 21st, Wolf Creek Nuclear Operating Corporation, which consists of Evergy, KEPCO, Evergy and KEPCO, filed a joint request for approval of their decommissioning financing plan for the Wolf Creek Generating Station, or the nuclear plant as it's better known, or more commonly known. These decommissioning dockets are designed to approve a methodology which reasonably estimates the cost to decommission plants and set a cost escalation rate. And this docket represents the 13th review over the last 30 years of the cost to decommission Wolf Creek. On June 21st, the Wolf Creek Corporation, Evergy staff, KEPCO, and CURB filed a joint motion to approve a settlement and agreement, which under that, the cost of the decommissioning funding would be, let's see, I think it's $1,171,363,200 in 2023 dollars, as set forth in the decommissioning cost analysis, which uses the decon alternative for Wolf Creek. And then on July 24th, the commission held an evidentiary hearing where all the parties were present. Since this is a unanimous settlement as defined by KAR 82-1-230A, the commission reviews the record to determine whether the settlement is supported by substantial competent evidence, will result in just and reasonable rates, and is in the public interest. This order finds that having reviewed the record as a whole, there is substantial competent evidence to support approval of the unanimous settlement agreement. Under the decon alternative methodology, Evergy does not expect its required annual contribution to increase, and KEPCO expects its required annual contribution to only increase by about $2,500, which is a de minimis impact on rates. Therefore, to the extent that rates are impacted by this settlement agreement, the commission finds those rates will be just and reasonable. And lastly, the order finds that the settlement agreement is in the public interest. Since the commission is adopting the decon alternative methodology and proposed funding levels outlined in the unanimous settlement agreement, subsequent individual funding dockets are not necessary. And also, since there was testimony that Wolf Creek may apply to extend its operating license for an additional 20 years, the commission directs Wolf Creek to include in its future triennial filings an update of any plans to pursue supplemental licensing and extend the life of the plant beyond 2045. With that, I'm available for questions.
All right, thank you, Brian.
Sure.
Are there any questions on this item, beginning with Commissioner Keither
No, thank you, Brian.
and Commissioner Keen?
Yes, I'd add my kudos there as well. Thank you, Brian, for the overview. The Wolf Creek facility is, I think it's one of two of the nuclear facilities within the what was the footprint? I'm not sure today with the expansion to the west, but what was the footprint of SPP? This is an important docket. All matters having to do with this facility are really critical to ratepayers in Kansas and elsewhere. And having said that, I would move approval of the order.
Okay.
Got a motion to approve the order as described in this docket and a second. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The order is approved. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
We now move to our second noticed item. This is in docket number 24 CONS 3103 CUNI, and this is a proposed order on petitions for reconsideration. Our presenter for this item is Mr. John Myers. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Chair French, and good morning, Commissioners. The order before you denies the protesters' requests for reconsideration of the Commission's final order in this docket. I'm available for any questions.
All right, thank you, John. Are there any questions on this item, beginning with Commissioner Keither
No.
and Commissioner Keen?
No questions. As said on any order, I am dissenting on this order as well for the reasons set out and forth in the dissenting opinion.
All right, do I have a motion to approve this order?
I move that we approve this order.
And I will second that motion. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say no.
No.
The order is approved. Thank you, John. All right, we will now move to our last noticed order. This is in docket number 25, EKCE 123 COM, and this is a proposed order on prima facie determination. And our presenter for this item is Mr. Aaron Bailey. Good morning, Aaron. Aaron, you're on mute. There you go.
I'm getting used to this Zoom thing.
Yeah.
Good morning, Commission. So this is a complaint that was filed by Sheila Hudson against Evergy, essentially alleging that they overcharged her for about 2 years. Her energy got cut off, and she's requesting just consideration and reconnection of her energy. And so we do believe that the complaint meets the test in KAR 82-1-220B. So we do recommend that the case is opened and let Evergy answer.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Are there any questions on this item, beginning with Commissioner Keither
No.
and Commissioner Keen?
Questions of approval of the order?
Okay.
All right, I think I heard a motion and a second, although I think I was cutting out a little bit. But with that, is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The order is approved. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we have now concluded all of the approval of orders, and we move to our discussion item, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities. And we have a new presenter on this item today. For anybody that's been watching these presentations over the last couple of years, our presenter was Ms. Sherry Albrecht. Ms. Sherry Albrecht has decided to retire and leave us, but we are in good hands. Mr. Justin Grady has taken over that role and will be giving these updates on SPP activities. So with that, Justin, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I think you have the ability to share your screen if you want to bring up your presentation.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good morning, commissioners. I am going to try to share my screen. We'll see how this goes. I don't feel terrible about this because I know that Sherry used to struggle about as much as I am.
Right.
Okay, what are you guys seeing right now?
I see your PowerPoint, but it's not full screen. There you go.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Well, good morning again. Thank you, for the opportunity to do this. It's an honor. There's a couple of things I have to apologize for in advance. One, I tried to define every acronym within this presentation, and then I realized the futility of that, and that's just not going to happen. So I will do my best to, because, the slides would have been double, right? There's a lot of acronyms in this world. So I'm going to do my absolute best to define them as I go along. And the other thing I can commit to do, if the commissioners would desire, is, I can provide you all with a list of each of these acronyms and what they mean, to the best of my ability. And the second thing I need to apologize for in advance is the fact that there's no possible way I'm going to adequately fill the giant shoes left for me by Sherry Albrecht, of course. So, but I'm going to do my best, and we're in it together. Okay, so here's the agenda. It's basically going to follow pretty similar cadence and a pretty similar organization from what Sherry provided. I'm just going to talk about basically all things SPP and FERC, not all things FERC and not all things SPP, but the vast majority of things that are significantly affecting Kansas that have changed basically since May 31st, since Sherry last made this presentation to the commission. And you can see the agenda there, and we'll walk through each of those. The first that we're going to talk about is the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue, otherwise known as JTIQ. This revision request, RR 620, did pass unanimously at the RSC special business meeting on June 10th that was held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The board also approved this revision request on June 12th, 2024. We'll talk about what that means and what the board has really approved at this point. And as this moves through the process, what's left with JTIQ. We'll talk about what it is and what's left and what's next. Okay, so JTIQ has been under development, actually, implementation type development since 2020. So this is an effort that was probably contemplated prior to that, but it's been under actual development within SPP and within MISO since 2020. It is essentially a portfolio of 7 jointly planned transmission projects, cost allocation policies, changes in the joint operating agreement between SPP and MISO, and all the tariff changes that are necessary to accomplish it. It at its root, the JTIQ concept is oriented around strengthening the interconnections between SPP and MISO, not necessarily for the purpose of increasing reliability, although that is a sort of a side benefit. But these projects were specifically planned and designed to unlock the queue and to aid in the connection of additional generation assets around around in between and the seams, or in other words, the borders between SPP and MISO. And we can talk more about that and what the benefits are of that to both regions. JTIQ did undergo a series of stakeholder group approvals in the second quarter. So it went through the Markets and Operations Policy Committee, Cost Allocation Working Group, Regional State Committee, and then the board. I'll show you a slide here in a second that talks about these individual 7 transmission projects, but the study that these projects were born out of evaluated the existing transmission constraints that existed between these 2 RTOs. And these were very much targeted projects to unlock the ability to add significant amounts of generation around the seams and of these 2 RTOs, which, as the commissioners know, basically goes from Louisiana to Canada. So this is, we're not talking about just projects necessarily between Kansas and Missouri, for instance, but these 2 RTOs basically take up the entire central part of the United States. And it's significant. These, for a planning level estimate of $1.65 billion, between 28 and 53 gigawatts of additional generation is expected to be unlocked with these projects. I did include a link there to the actual JTIQ report, which was published in March of 2022. That's an active link on the files that you have. There's a really informative executive summary at the beginning of that, and all of the rest of the detail, the economic modeling and reliability modeling that went into it is in that report as well. We've talked about the planning level estimate of these 7 projects is $1.65 billion. I do have a list. Excuse me. I do have a list of the actual projects and where they're located between SPP and MISO coming up in a few slides. The interesting thing about this portfolio is that it was awarded a grant from the Department of Energy, the Grid Deployment Office, of $464 million. And so prior to the awarding of that grant, the cost allocation plan was that 10% of the cost of these projects would be paid for by load. And then there was a split between SPP and MISO based on the adjusted production cost or the benefits associated with these projects. But with the funding of this $464 million, the cost allocation changed and actually it went to basically load plays customers play a backstop role in funding these projects. In other words, the expectations by, I think, everybody involved is that these lines will be fully subscribed with additional generators, and the generators, before the projects are built, the generators are going to sign up and commit and agree to pay for the cost of the projects. But in the event that there's timing issues, basically customers pay in the short run, and then ultimately those payments are repaid back to customers from generators in the form of levelized revenue requirements over the 20 years of these assets. And so this is a situation where, essentially we know that there are dual benefits associated with these projects. There are sort of incidental adjusted production cost benefits that come for customers associated with these projects and reliability benefits. But because generators also want to interconnect along these seams, the idea is, the expectation is that they will be willing to actually fund the projects, and the benefits to load will sort of just be residual and will occur. And for that, the commitment of the load is to to basically backstop these projects in the short term. The bullet 3 there just points out that, you know, constructing transmission owners that will build these projects will put them in their transmission formula rates. It will essentially be like regular transmission projects. And then when the credits are paid by the generators, that will go back to the customers to reimburse customers for those costs. And then you can see on that 4th bullet point there, the economic modeling that's been done to support these projects has almost $1 billion worth of adjusted production cost benefits. The majority of those benefits are being realized in MISO, and that's because the majority of these projects are being built in MISO, and you'll see that in an upcoming slide. I should have mentioned, and I meant to at the beginning of the presentation, I'm absolutely fine with being interrupted as we go along. We're going to talk about some pretty heavy topics here today. And I just think it's going to be much more efficient and effective to answer questions as they come up from the commissioners, you know, sort of topic by topic instead of waiting to the end. But, you know, either one is fine, of course, but if you want to interrupt me, please feel free. Okay, this slide just shows the path of stakeholder groups, basically the path of approval of RR 620, which is the JTIQ revision request. You can see the cost allocation working group unanimously approved this package with 10 votes. That doesn't happen every day. To get 10 states in the region with, you know, with frequently differing perspectives on a lot of these issues to vote in approval. There was unanimous approval at the Regional Tariff Working Group, Transmission Working Group, Economic Studies Working Group, and Transmission Working Group. Markets and Operations Policy Committee was 88% approval and unanimous approval at the RSC, and the board approved it in that special meeting. You can see a few abstentions and a few opposed, and those oppositions and abstentions were largely from the development community, and it was those concerns largely stemmed from the idea that there are significant benefits to customers that are coming from these projects, despite the fact that they were built essentially to allow additional generation to connect. And those developers opined that, you know, given the fact that these significant benefits are flowing to customers, should be committed to pay for a portion of these projects. You know, customers should permanently be paying for, say, 10 or 20% of the cost of these transmission lines, given the reliability and economic benefits they're going to accrue. That, you know, ultimately the policy decision on cost allocation was, given the Department of Energy funding that was received for the project, given the fact that these projects were initially planned essentially to hook up generation, that it changed to the fact that load was in more of a sort of a backstop or a timing role, but ultimately generators will pay for the cost of these projects. The next slide is just kind of shows where we are in the process. They're a little behind on this this timeline because they were targeting end of June for MISO approval. I do not think that's occurred yet, but we're not terribly off of where this stands. But you can see we're sort of at the end of this second phase here. The next thing to come is there will be a filing before FERC, a joint filing. I think it's going to be separate filings, but coordinated basically at the same time with both SPP and MISO. And then we'll see how FERC rules on this. This is it's definitely a case of first impression. It's definitely a unique plan and a uniquely planned and organized set of projects, and you know, I think this is the first time anything like this has been done in the country, so there is probably some risk at FERC in terms of, whether or not they think that we've gotten this right, basically. This is a map of the projects themselves. You can see one of these projects does affect Kansas, and that's the Auburn to Hoyt 345 kV line. That is a line that will intersect with a substation owned by Evergy Kansas Central. And so ultimately, I think we're several years away from this, but ultimately, I don't know about several years, but we are a couple of years away probably from this commission seeing a notice to construct and a line siting permit associated with that Auburn to Hoyt line. But there is one line that's affecting Kansas in this package. This is a list of the projects themselves and the planning level estimates of the costs of the lines right here. And you can see that, of the $1.6 billion worth of projects, $100 million of those projects is associated with projects that are actually in SPP, entirely within SPP. This run to S3452 345 kV line is a sort of an interregional project that will also have that will touch the SPP footprint. But then you can see it's interesting, and this table really goes to show you how interconnected we are with our neighbors, and how what happens in MISO affects SPP and vice versa. You can see that there are lines that are entirely constructed within the footprint of MISO, and yet there are reliability constraints that are resolved in SPP's system associated with those lines, and there are adjusted production cost benefits associated with those lines. So I think it really does go to show you, that it's the Eastern Interconnect is quite interconnected. A lot of times those megawatts, don't really know that they're on SPP or MISO system. It's, humans have to come up with the accounting and the metering and the allocation to understand those benefits and those costs. Okay, I'm going to pause. I've said a lot. I just want to make sure there's not any questions at this point. Hopefully I'm not disappointing too much so far, Chair.
You're doing wonderfully, but you're going to have to hustle. Don't you have 44 slides? No, it's fantastic.
I'll speed it up. All right. So this second issue that I wanted to update the commissioners on is another very important issue to the state of Kansas, and this is the HIT C2 sunflower waiver proposal before FERC. And so originally this was filed as a waiver process in which the SPP board of directors could evaluate certain transmission projects and determine whether or not those transmission projects were actually benefiting the region as a whole more than the zone that those transmission projects happen to be located in. For that waiver process has a tortured history and was approved before FERC and then denied and then maybe approved again and denied again. In any case, ultimately what was decided was to change that from a waiver process to a strict FERC or Federal Power Act Section 205 filing. And essentially just requesting that FERC make the decision themselves that these 10 transmission projects coming out of 4 notices to construct do benefit the SPP region as a whole, and because of that, the revenue requirement associated with those projects should be reallocated to the rest of the region. And that's $10.1 million of revenue requirement for sunflower customers. Because it's going to be reallocated to the rest of the region, it actually results in a little under $10 million of savings to sunflower. The KCC.
And Justin, that's an annual number, right?
Yes, it
their
is.
annual revenue. So that's the savings per year for the life of those projects. All right.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the clarification. So several parties filed comments in support. Several parties filed comments in opposition. This is definitely one of those issues that was not unanimously agreed to within the SPP footprint. So the Louisiana Public Service Commission and several Oklahoma utilities and Texas utilities filed comments in opposition to this filing. FERC did approve it on May 31st, 2024, effective June 1st, 2024. And there are several parties that have filed requests for rehearing. And the KCC and Sunflower and others have filed responses to those requests for rehearing. Those are pending before FERC, and what the results of those are, and then ultimately whether or not this filing will face an appeal is unknown at this point. Okay, so I told you I'd speed it up. We're now on to item 3. So this is the regional state committee business meeting and the joint stakeholder briefing. These meetings were held August 5th and 6th in St. Louis. We'll talk about the items that were approved by the regional state committee, and then I'll give you a few updates that I thought were interesting to the commission, that the commission would find interesting coming out of the joint stakeholder briefing, which was held that afternoon. And then we'll talk about the board of directors meeting, SPP board meeting, and what changed there and what came out of that. So the first thing the RSC approved was the 2025 budget. This was unanimously approved. The RSC's budget, you can see it's just under $600,000 a year. That covers all of the travel and the meeting expenses for on-site meetings of the RSC, as well as any meetings that RSC commissioners attend and travel to. For instance, the real meeting or the real task force that Chair French established 2 years ago, which stands for Realizing Energy Assurance Leadership. Or no, is it resource realizing? What is it, Chair French?
Resource and Energy Adequacy Leadership Team.
Okay, thank you. I can't believe I forgot that.
It's easy. Come on.
I'm sorry. My inability to remember that particular acronym is definitely should not be an indictment as to the importance of that task force. They're really doing important work, and it was a great idea to establish it when you did. So the budget does include 6 in-person COG and real meetings. I think the expectation is actually for 4 in-person COG meetings. And that's the real reason for the budget jump. That was an issue that wasn't necessarily controversial, but there were some pretty firmly held positions about whether the cost allocation working group should be meeting in person more. This is a group that I'm a voting member of now, and filling in for Sherry. She was a member of COG before. Before the pandemic, COG met every month in person, and then obviously since the pandemic, that's been more like 90 or 95% virtual. And a majority of the membership has expressed a desire to get together and meet more in person. They think that those meetings are more effective. And so in any case, there were people that wanted to meet every month. There were people that wanted to meet maybe once or twice a year. And so 4 in-person meetings is where we landed as a stakeholder group. The 2023 audit results were also presented at the RSC business meeting. Those were unanimously approved, and there were no adverse findings. And then the nominating committee was another issue that was on the agenda. So the nominating committee, the purpose of the nominating committee is to nominate a slate of officers to serve on the regional state committee in 2025. And you can see there that pursuant to the bylaws, the way this works is it's essentially it's a nomination process for who's on the nominating committee, and then ultimately that has to be approved by the full RSC. President Tuma recommended the illustrious Andrew French, as well as Mike Francis of Louisiana Public Service Commission, and Christy Fegan, who is currently the chair of the REAL team from South Dakota, to be on the nominating committee. And that was unanimously approved. So Chair French and Commissioner Fegan and Francis will meet between now and the October set of October RSC meetings, and they will recommend a new slate of officers for RSC for 2025. Okay, now we're really getting into the meat of things. So there were two very important revision requests that were approved at the August set of meetings, RSC and board meetings. I'm gonna get into these. I'm gonna talk about them at a pretty detailed level. These are going to have, these are going to be significant policies that will affect utilities in the state of Kansas, as well as the reliability of our state and our region for many years to come. These, both of these policies were originally conceived after Winter Storm Uri in the IRATF stakeholder group, which Sherry served on, and that was the Improved Resource Adequacy Task Force, Improved Resource Availability Task Force. These, if there's anybody listening sort of at home or the casual observer might ask, why are we still making policy changes after Winter Storm Uri 4 years later? And that's because these policies are not easy to get consensus on. They're not easy to get FERC approval for. Several of these ideas and concepts are now on their third or fourth iteration in terms of trying to make their way through the stakeholder process and get approval at FERC. But these are important policy changes that are going to have significant effects on the utilities in our region going forward. So I am going to spend some time on them. Interrupt me if you have any questions. Essentially, what Fuel Assurance RR 621 does is it attempts to appropriately account for the performance of conventional generators during the most extreme critical timeframes for reliability and during the winter. Okay, so it's the top 3% of net load hours, and you'll see, we'll go into some of the specifics, but it's essentially an effort to better identify and understand the actual performance that we can expect out of these units during the absolute most critical times when we need them the most. This effort is basically it's an add-on, or it's a supplement to the performance-based accreditation policies that are currently pending before FERC. And again, it focuses on those most extreme hours of the year, with the intent that if SPP focuses on those most extreme hours and accredits resources based on, at least in part, based on how they performed during those extreme hours, that load serving entities will be incentivized to take actions such as on-site fuel or additional winterization investments, et cetera. And as we'll talk about later as well, RR 621 is critically tied to RR 622, which is the planning reserve margin policy. So this slide just shows how RR 621 made its way through the stakeholder process. So this passed the Supply Adequacy Working Group at 15-0 with 3 abstentions. It passed COG unanimously. The real team voted on RR 621 and 622 as a package. And so it only passed 9-4 to 1. But I think the consensus there was that if RR 621 had been voted on separately, it would have received unanimous approval or close to unanimous approval at the real team. And then Markets and Operations Policy Committee approved this 92%. So now we're kind of getting into the meat of what this really means. And this is a after the fact historical evaluation that looks back at conventional resources and says, you know, how did you perform during that top 3% of net load hours during the winter? And it's 7 years of historical data beginning in 2022. So assuming that this can be approved for the winter of 2026, there will be 4 actual years of data, and then there will be 3 years that rely on class average performances for these types of units. And then eventually, ultimately, it will be all historical actual data for the previous 7 years. And, you know, again, as I mentioned, this is additive to the performance-based accreditation process, which accounts for all hours of the winter, all hours of the summer, but excludes out of management control type outages, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So these are the tariff definitions. These are brand new tariff definitions that came out of this process, the fuel assurance process. And I'm not going to read those, but they're there, and they're a reference for both commissioners and anybody else that accesses this presentation later online. Okay, so this flow chart is, I mean, some people find it busy and maybe confusing. It's very, very helpful to me to sort of think through and understand the difference between performance-based accreditation and fuel assurance. Okay, so it's separated here by winter and summer. As we're going to talk about soon with the RR 622, there is now a separate, or there will be, once it's approved by FERC, a separate winter planning reserve margin for the first time in SPP. Again, these policy changes are coming out of Winter Storm Uri impacts. Right now, the fuel assurance will only apply in the winter. There are discussions underway and evaluation as to whether or not this should apply for the summer as well, for correlated outages that can occur in the summer due to excessive heat, due to low water conditions, for droughts and other environmental conditions that can take conventional resources out of operation. So the E4D stands for equivalent forced outage rate, or something very similar to that. And this essentially accounts for the unit's actual performance during all hours of the winter. Okay, it accounts for forced outages and partial forced outages, but it excludes NERC GADS data that is, which is generation availability database, I think, or generation availability statistics, essentially. And so E4D and the performance-based accreditation excludes out-of-management control events, all out-of-management control events. And so when this policy was approved, there was a recognition that there's a little bit left on the table here, essentially. This doesn't fully adequately account for or capture how these generating resources perform during extreme events like Winter Storm Uri. And so as a result, we come to the fuel assurance policy, which takes into account a resources EFOF, and that stands for equivalent forced outage factor. And that is a little bit more exacting yet in terms of there are more out of management control events that are included, but those are only fuel related out of management control events. So if a tornado comes through and takes out a generating unit, for instance, that is not included in a resources EFOF. But if if a resource fails to have, say, firm transportation or supply availability for its fuel, or if a coal pile freezes solid to the ground because the load serving entity didn't appropriately coat that coal pile with antifreeze liquid, then that would be included. And so again, this only applies to the top 3% of adjusted net peak load hours. And then that resources EFOF is adjusted for incremental outage impact, which we'll talk about. And ultimately, you get to the conventional resource performance adjustment, essentially where the rubber meets the road of, what does this mean in terms of the accredited capacity of conventional resources? This is the actual formula. And I know this looks intense, but I just put it in here for the reference materials. And it's not really that intense. Really, what's happening here is this seasonal correlated outages is the amount of seasonally correlated outages that are reflected in the loss of load expectation study that SPP does. And the critical period allocator is essentially, this is essentially an allocation of those correlated outages that are reflected in the loss of load expectation study. Okay, this says, how is your specific unit, the non-performance of your unit, how does that compare to the entire fleet across SPP's non-performance? And so it's an allocating factor to account for the seasonal correlated outages. This is a numerical example using the final numbers in terms of the amount of incremental outages that are reflected in the loss of load expectation study for 2026. This is an example of a 100 megawatt unit that has a 10% E4D or performance-based accreditation and a 20% EFOF percentage. And the idea here is that this 20% EFOF is not entirely applied to the unit. It's ratioed down basically by the amount of incremental outage impact of 4102 that was included in the loss of load expectation study. And so basically what we're getting at there is, and we'll talk about this a little more, but not all of the units, not all of the decremented capacity reduction that occurs during that top 3% net load hours. For instance, what happened during Winter Storm Uri, not all of that is accounted for in the loss of load expectation study. Actually, only 50% of that has been accounted for in the planning reserve margin and in the application of this fuel assurance example calculation. And the reason for that was a hotly debated and specifically developed policy to recognize the fact that there have been a lot of improvements in the generating fleet since Winter Storm Uri. There has been additional investments in winterization. There has been additional investments in firm fuel delivery, and we've learned a lot of lessons since Winter Storm Uri as well. And so that's the reason that only 50% of the incremental cold weather outages were reflected in a loss of load expectation study. And that's the reason for this sort of, ratioing down of the individual impact of an individual unit.
And Justin, could it also be, part of that conversation is that, look, we've got some units that are real workhorses throughout the whole year. And if you put too much weight on just those critical hours, maybe you run the risk of undervaluing some units that are producing a lot of energy for us all throughout the year, that we're counting on to be there all throughout the year. Even if maybe they aren't, the most flexible units in those net peak load hours. I think, at least from my perspective, I guess that was part of why we haven't put complete full weight on decrementing for those hours. Is that part of that conversation?
Yep, absolutely. Okay, I'm switching topics here. We're going to planning reserve margin. I want to give anybody an opportunity to ask questions about what we've talked about so far. Okay. So now we're talking about planning reserve margin. And this is another critically important decision that was made last week for our region and SPP and the utilities that serve in Kansas and the customers that receive that service. So for the first time, starting in the winter of 2026, 2027, SPP will have a winter planning reserve margin. The reasons for this are varied and extensive. Again, a lot of lessons were learned coming out of Winter Storm Uri. And there is a growing recognition that the real risk of reliability outages that SPP faces and the member utilities that are members of SPP, including all the utilities in the state of Kansas, the reliability risks we face as a region and as a state are occurring in the winter. And that is actually showing up in the reliability models, and it's extensive. So we're talking about a shift from used to be maybe 20% or 30% to 95% of the likelihood of us having a reliability outage is in the winter in some of those further loss of load expectation studies like 2026 and 2029. So in any case, what passed the Regional State Committee and the Board of Directors was a 36% winter planning reserve margin and a 16% planning reserve margin for 2026. We are currently at a 15% planning reserve margin for 2020 or for right now in SPP. That changed a few years ago and it went up from 12. And essentially the planning reserve margin is the level of operating capacity, operating reserves that the region carries over and above your peak load expectation. We'll talk about specifically what that means for a winter planning reserve margin here in a second. I will call out that this vote was not unanimous. Oklahoma and Texas voted no. Their utilities, the utilities in Oklahoma and Texas have been quite vocal and in voicing their opposition to increasing the planning reserve margin as quickly as it has increased. I think if you talk to Kansas utilities that voted no or that have concerns about these planning reserve margins as well, it's mostly about the idea that it takes 5 to 7 years to build a new large conventional generator, and in order to get through the generation interconnection queue study process, in order to get in line in terms of the supply chain difficulties that we're facing in this country, and in order to actually build the generating unit. And that's assuming that you don't have siting concerns or local siting difficulty getting your unit built. And so anyway, it's a big policy discussion in terms of whether we should set the planning reserve margin at the level that we think is right for the region, and then sort of help utilities that have a problem with compliance through something like a sufficiency valuation curve or 2 or 3 year compliance window. But ultimately, those are the kind of discussions that have been occurring for the last several months, if not years, leading up to the setting of this planning reserve margin.
Yeah, Justin, and I'll just add on because I think the natural question here is why are Oklahoma and Texas voting against? Essentially, their major concern, I think, was the winter planning reserve margin, not so much the summer. And I think naturally somebody would say, well, these are summer peaking utilities that use a lot of air conditioning. Why do they care that much about the winter planning reserve margin? And I think there are a couple things here, and I hate to speak for them, but they're not here. But reading the tea leaves of comments that were made in working groups are, I think a couple things. I think the regulatory atmospheres in those two jurisdictions have basically forced their utilities to operate on razor thin generating capacity margins. Even though the planning reserve margin is a floor, it's like the absolute minimum that of capacity you have to carry. I think that's basically what a lot of those utilities have been forced to operate at. So they're going to have to build or acquire generation anytime the planning reserve margin moves. Whereas pretty much the rest of the footprint has some wiggle room, or was probably planning ahead a little more, or was able to plan ahead a little more. I'm not imputing the actions of the utilities in those areas. I think the other piece is there's definitely a concern from southern utilities about that fuel assurance policy, and all the states voted in favor of it. Everybody thinks it's the right thing to do, but with performance-based accreditation and with that consideration of how folks perform in those critical hours, you are going to see the more winterized workhorse facilities not really be impacted by those policies, and actually probably get better accreditations as a result of those policies. So the people up in the northern part of the footprint that all have their plants winterized, ready to go for a winter storm Uri type of event, generally didn't see any outages in those kind of events. They're not going to be impacted. Where it's actually the people in the southern part of the footprint whose facilities are not winterized to that extent are probably going to be the more impacted. They're really unsure of where their accreditation is going to land, because they don't know maybe how their units are going to perform year to year in those events, and so there's some uncertainty there for them as well. So I think those are some combining factors on why the southern utilities and states were. I don't know that they're against it. I don't know that they think that the numbers that we approved are the wrong numbers. I think they just thought there's a lot of uncertainty, and we would really like some more time to get ahead of this. So that's the other color I would just put on that, Justin.
Thanks for adding that. That's absolutely accurate. And I do get into a little more of the rationale for the no votes, I guess, or the dissension in the next page or on the next slide. But just a few more quick points here. Essentially what the 2023 loss of load expectation study showed, which studied and evaluated the year 2026 and 2029. And what those studies showed was that a 15% planning reserve margin for the summer of 2026 will not satisfy the 1 day in 10 loss of load expectation threshold, which is a requirement in SPP's tariff at FERC. And also that's just the industry standard that everybody holds to. So there was an absolute requirement to increase the 2026 summer PRM. And then, just generally, we talked about the issues in the last bullet point there, the cold weather impacts, the changing resource mix in the region and in the country, aging conventional fleet that is requiring, that's being asked to do more and more and be more and more flexible. And as a result is taking, longer and maybe less planned maintenance outages. So we'll continue talking about these issues. So for the entities that voted no within the members committee or utilities that did not support the 36%, a lot of those entities wanted a 33% winter planning reserve margin. We'll talk a little bit about that and why they went in that direction or leaned in that direction. And others wanted more time to comply and said, 2026 is only 2 years away. If we are short, there's absolutely no way that we can become compliant at that time. I will say that, Kansas utilities are expected to fare just fine in terms of these changes, in terms of the requirements. And, I'm not speaking for anybody else besides myself, but I just wasn't terribly convinced by the arguments of we don't have enough time to comply. And the reason for that is because The region as a whole right now has 37.5% headroom. And so what that tells me is that the capacity does exist in the region. And if SPP is telling us we have to have 36% in order to keep the lights on in the winter, then in my mind, the compliance pathway is to essentially contract for the capacity that does exist other places within SPP. And, essentially, what that does is compensate the entities that have been supporting the reliability of the region and that are expected to continue to support the reliability of the region, appropriately. So I know that's a big policy issue that we could probably spend an hour talking about on that issue alone. But our view was that there isn't anything wrong with people being quote out of compliance. We prefer that they not be out of compliance, but if you are in non-compliance, then you need to get compliant and basically compensate the people that are supporting the reliability in the region. This was a split vote at the Supply Adequacy Working Group in terms of who 3616 actually failed to advance at a 9-9 vote at SOG. They ultimately approved the 3316, honestly, because they couldn't approve a different number, and that approved at 14-3. The Markets and Operations Policy Committee, I think, was heavily influenced by the results of SOG, because SOG does report to them. They approved the 3316 with 75%, and then sort of miserably failed to approve a 3616 with only 33% approval. You can see the real voting there was 9-4-1, again, mostly with the Oklahoma utilities and Arkansas utilities opposing, as well as the Public Utilities Commission of Texas abstained. And then COG voted 9-1-2 with Oklahoma Corporation Commission and Louisiana Public Service Commission voting. Oklahoma Corporation Commission voted no. Louisiana and Texas abstained. I will tell you that we spoke very strongly in support of a 36% planning reserve margin. I personally spoke very strongly in support of this at COG. It's actually something I feel very passionately about. We currently have 37.5% headroom in the winter right now within SPP. And for the last 3 winters in a row, we have had a winter storm that made it incapable of SPP serving their own load without relying on our other regions for imports into SPP. I just think that you can't state that more strongly than I just did. I think people don't talk about it near enough. It's absolutely unquestionable to me, or it's without question that we need more capacity in SPP. We need more winter capacity. We need more capacity that has the ability to be called on at a moment's notice. And I thought that, Kansas's support of a 36% winter planning reserve margin was sort of support for all of those sentiments and a vote in support of reliability during the winter. Okay, Commissioner Keene, I see that you're off camera.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate this and the granularity of your response. Let me be the devil's advocate on a couple of questions here with respect to bullet point 3, if I can. Because we're talking across in terms of the 37.5% headroom, as I understand, that's SPP headroom, right? That's the region headroom within SPP talking about.
Region wide, yep.
Yeah, right. So I'm going to kind of ask you to maybe juxtapose that against some of the Kansas needs and demands. Given that 37.5%, if there's additional load in the future, does that 37.5% across any part of the footprint of SPP, does that 37.5% go away pretty quickly?
Absolutely. Yep. Yes, load growth will eat into the headroom that we have. The load growth and the peak load growth that we have experienced in the last several years within SPP has already eaten into that headroom. Absolutely.
Okay. And so that's going to be the result in part, is it not? Isn't that based in part upon the changing resource mix and the impact that that has upon this peak reserve margin across the footprint?
The changing resource mix is absolutely one of the factors that is influencing the need for the planning reserve margin that was accounted for in the loss of load expectation studies. In other words, absolutely, the fact that there have been retirements within SPP, the fact that there are additional retirements projected within SPP. Now those are slowing down dramatically, and a lot of utilities have changed their plans, and are doing everything they can to keep those conventional units as long as possible. But absolutely, I mean, there are a number of factors that are leading to, influencing the fact that with less than a 36% level of reserves in the winter, SPP load within SPP and Kansas as a result are facing increasingly larger risks to reliability associated with being able to keep the lights on during extreme winter weather events.
And so individual states like Kansas, in some instances, could really be subjected to the vicissitudes of the group at large that have a different resource mix. Isn't that right? There are going to be states out there that are going to aggressively do away with coal plants, where we have coal plants that may have more longevity than others, for example. So with those who do away with that, that has an effect on the planning reserve margin, does it not?
It does. I mean, I think it's something that's pretty important here is that this is this is only for SPP East, right? So we need to remember that.
Yes.
The expansion that's occurred within SPP, I mean, this is Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, so Nebraska, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota. So there are changing resource mixes that are occurring throughout SPP, but they're
not as dramatic as they are to the west.
Sorry?
They aren't as dramatic as they are to the west.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and Commissioner Keene, I would just make the point. I don't know how clear the interrelationship is between changing resource mix and the planning reserve margin. I'd have to think about that a little more, but it definitely is going to impact those states on how they comply with the planning reserve margin. I mean, we're putting pretty granular accreditation practices into place. And I mean, if you look at how those work, I mean, if somebody wants to really aggressively change from, for example, a thermal fleet to just wind and solar, that's going to be very expensive. You're going to have to build a lot to meet your whole planning reserve margin with the way that we accredit those resources. And in fact, because of the way we accredit them with diminishing accreditation, the more that you put on the system, I don't think it would be physically possible for somebody to meet an entire planning reserve margin with intermittent resources. They would have to have an incredible amount of batteries. And I mean, at least with today's technology, they're going to have some dispatchable units in their fleet. So I would have to think a little bit more about whether the type of units impact the planning reserve margin. Definitely, the performance of different units impacts planning reserve margin, but certainly your changing mix of resources is going to impact how you comply with the planning reserve margin.
Okay, thank you. Um, uh, Justin, again, going back to some of the earlier slides that you reviewed for us, demonstrating a relationship, certainly the interrelationship that the SPP footprint has with MISO. So too there, isn't it true that would changes within MISO over which SPP would have limited if little control could also have an effect on the SPP planning reserve margin, could they not?
Yeah, so I think what I would say there is that these planning reserve margins and these loss of load expectation studies are currently not accounting for the ability to import on a non-firm basis any energy imports from other regions. Okay. And so there is a call for that. You know, I don't know if a call for that is the right word. There are stakeholders that have expressed the desire to evaluate whether we can lower the planning reserve margin and just assume that we can, or maybe evaluate through some probabilistic modeling, the ability to call on neighboring regions during times of extreme weather with non-firm imports. The problem with that, in my opinion, is exactly as you just said, in that, you know, I think the further east or west you go from the central part of the country, the changing resource mix policies and the pace of that is all occurring way faster the further east and west you go from the central part of the country, right? And so, you know, unfortunately, our ability, this is just my opinion, is our ability to rely on, to count on the ability to rely on these other regions during times of extreme weather is just, I'm just not as confident about as I would like to be. So that's today, the 36% PRM is not being affected by MISO's resource changes today, because we're evaluating this on an SPP standalone basis. The other thing I will quickly say is I don't view that this is, you know, like we're setting the planning reserve margin excessively high in order to allow for more resource transition or more coal retirements, et cetera. That's not what's occurring in my opinion. In fact, I think what's happening is with the approval of 621 and 622 together, this is sending very strong signals from SPP to the region that, and also performance-based accreditation and ELCC, which was filed, you know, earlier this year, is saying, look, we all recognize that there are times of the year when conventional resources are providing 95% of the megawatts that keep the lights on. And these are fuel neutral policies, but what it says is if we call on you and you're unable to perform during these extreme events, we are going to recognize your lack of performance and you are going to have to basically replace that. You know, to Chair French's point, I mean, batteries and wind and solar, these things only get, I mean, we do need more of them in certain times of the year. Don't get me wrong, but you're not going to be able to comply basically with this set of policies. Load serving entities are not going to be able to comply with these policies by just adding wind or just adding solar or just adding batteries. That's why you're seeing the big load serving entities throughout the region, including in their integrated resource planning models and plans, 2 new natural gas fired combined cycle units, 3 new natural gas fired combined cycle units. It's because with a little planning and firm transportation and firm supply and maybe additional storage and winterization and or maybe on-site fuel or dual fuel capability, there's a pretty high likelihood those units are going to work regardless of what the weather is like outside. And so, you know, these policies are recognizing that, and in my opinion, and formalizing the fact that we need that stuff. So
Appreciate the granularity of your response very much. So, Justin, two more quick questions and I'm done here, because this is really an important issue, I think. We all want to have rates that are as affordable as possible for ratepayers. We also want to have reliability. So whatever the weather gods may throw our way, we're capable of providing uninterrupted service. We're all striving for those goals. But a major policy level concern I have is that with the potential for increased demand load, what's going to be the impact on ratepayers of moving from a 15% reserve margin to 36%? And that concern arises from what I think would be the capital cost that would be borne by ratepayers that could be associated with additional generation or transmission necessary to satisfy that higher reserve margin. So that's my concern in the long expanse of this, is that that's a heck of a jump from 16 to 36. That's not saying that it's giving recognition to things that maybe should have been recognized before, or that concerns that we're going to have prospectively that we inadequately answered in the past. Okay, yeah. I'll give you that too. With respect to the regulated and jurisdictional utilities and those that are affected by what we do here in Kansas, my last question is really this: does this change to a 36%, in effect, regional planning reserve margin? Does it disproportionately affect Evergy, Sunflower, Midwest, Southern Pioneer, Liberty? If so, how?
Yeah. Okay, so keep me honest here, because I'm going to try to answer both questions. I almost interrupted you and said, let me answer the first one. I didn't want to do that, so keep me honest.
Forget the last one for a moment.
Okay. So if you were to look at, and I will share this with you. We'll pull up the summer 2024 resource adequacy reports and resource adequacy workbooks. Kansas's utilities are going to fare just fine as a result of these changes in the planning reserve margin. They are. And so I haven't talked to a single Kansas utility, and we talked to them all, who have said that they will not be able to comply with these requirements. In fact, I don't think there is a Kansas utility that disagrees that 36% is the right number. The times, the utilities that I talked to that might have voted no at one place or another in the stakeholder process did so to send a message to SPP that we need more time to comply. We should set this for 2029 yesterday, right? Because it takes too long to build things. We can meet these requirements today. Because we're a summer peaking utility, we have far in excess of 36% planning reserve margin capacity in Kansas today. And the other thing is, and it's a few slides in, but we're going to talk about the difference between ACAP and ICAP, or installed capacity and accredited capacity planning reserve margin. And it's not actually 36% that anybody's going to be judged against. It's actually 13.1%, which is just kind of complicated, but you got to account for performance-based accreditation and the fuel assurance policies. But the reliability is, affordability is absolutely a key consideration, and it's very much included in the give and take and the policy discussions that go on, right? I personally think that reliability should be number one, and then affordability should be as close to that reliability as you can. And I know that different regulators will maybe switch those two around, or provide more emphasis on affordability versus reliability sort of throughout the year. What we all know is that the day after Winter Storm Uri, we didn't get any calls from the governor's office or legislators or customers that lost $1 million worth of product. they weren't asking us about affordability anymore, right? It was what are we doing to prevent another Winter Storm Uri? And the reality is this 36% PRM, it won't prevent another Winter Storm Uri, right? It would take 45% to prevent another Winter Storm Uri. So this is, and it's not, the other thing is utilities have never planned, Kansas utilities have never planned to a planning reserve margin of 15% for the winter because they planned in the summer and they already have that capacity in the winter as a result. So, you can think about this in my mind as almost almost accounting for the status quo or keeping the amount of capacity that we have, and then moving forward, these numbers are likely to go up from there. The other quick thing is the 36%. I mean, just me, Justin, on behalf of me and all of the analysis that I did, I would have been at 37%. I really would have. The market monitoring unit of SPP may very well file a protest when this is filed saying, nope, the absolute minimum should be 37%. We have 37.5% right now. The last thing is, I honestly believe 36% is the absolute bare minimum that we can afford to have from a reliability perspective. In other words, we can't be the first region in the country to be planning to a standard below 1 day in 10, right? I mean, if we are going to do that, I think that requires much more significant policy level discussion at the legislature and everywhere else, because customers have become accustomed to a level of reliability that's greater than 1 day in 10. And this is really about maintaining that industry standard. It's definitely not gold plating the system or, doing everything we can and putting reliability way above affordability. So thanks for the ability to answer that.
Justin, you said this, but I just want to say it really clearly, just to make clear, because we heard this in the stakeholder process too, of gosh, this is more than you're more than doubling the PRM. You're going from 15% to 36%. And just to be very clear, that is not what's happening. The summer PRM is going from 15% to 16%. We have never had a winter PRM, and we are setting for the first time a winter PRM of 36%. And as Justin explained, all of our Kansas utilities already have enough headroom to hit that 36% because they're summer peaking utilities. I think there is a whole debate about, just looking at this, zooming out at the macro level. The Kansas utilities have taken a more conservative approach. They have carried more generating capacity than sort of the minimum planning reserve margin for a number of years. That has served them very well now when we're getting more granular and we're getting a little tougher on folks and we are increasing the planning reserve margins. We see that our utilities, that probably were taking a more conservative approach, they're set up well. Now that means that we probably paid for that extra level of reliability over the years, and that's a whole policy debate. I mean, there are states that didn't value that extra cushion of reliability, and they're in a bind now. But whether how you weigh those things, that's a policy discussion. But to be clear, the Kansas utilities are not going to have to build anything right now today to meet this planning reserve margin. But Commissioner Keene, to your point about new demand, increasing demand, that they probably are going to have to build to meet that in the future. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Thank you both.
Okay, I'm going to try to speed up. I mean, we've got 36 minutes, 37 minutes. Assuming
and Justin, just so you know, I have to drop at 11:45 for another obligation. So if that happens, I'm going to turn over presiding officer to Commissioner Keene to close us out.
Okay. I'll do my best here. I think we can speed up, and we've had a lot of good conversations so far. And one other thing I think you're going to see as we go through these, Commissioner Keen, is that the increasing level of focus on how utilities are actually performing during extreme weather events, I think is actually going to bode quite well for Kansas. And it's what it is it's instead of purely socializing the obligation by just increasing the planning reserve margin that everybody has to hit, what it does is it accurately apportions the compliance requirements based on how you're actually performing during these extreme events. And so we'll get into that, but I think you'll see that here. But so this is just a quick rundown of what was in the 2023 loss of load expectation study. And I think this is to a part of Commissioner Keen's point of, to a certain extent, this is more accurately evaluating the risk that's always existed, or that's existed in the last, 5 to 10 years, based on much more extensive reliability assessments. And so this is the most robust reliability assessment that SPP's ever performed. 43 actual years of weather. And so what happens is basically they take the existing resource mix today and go back and backcast it and say, how would it have performed in 1981 or 1984 during the cold snap, et cetera. Okay, so these are 2 slides for the summer and the winter PRM capacity. And these slides really tell the story in terms of why these were just requirements. So the blue line here is the actual historical operating capacity margin. And you can see that we were very, very close to load shed during the last couple major winter storms. We made it, but we made it with the ability to import power into our region. At the minimum level of operating capacity, SPP is saying, it's certainly possible that we can experience load sheds right now in the summer of 24 and 25 and 26. With more of a median level of operating capacity. We're a few years away from that. And this is the actual planning reserve margin that's occurred over that period of time, the changes in that. And so this is the reason why this number needed to be bumped up. So for winter, again, same data, and you can see here's Winter Storm Uri, and you can see what the projections are for the 25, 26, and 27 with the minimum. These are operating capacity minimums. In other words, these are not unheard of levels of outages, actual unit outages that could occur. So you can see 26 and 27, even with median levels of conventional unit performance, things are getting really, really tight in the next several years. This is just a sort of an overview slide of, the reason that that ultimately the recommendation was to go to 37.5 or 36%. This is another quick point that probably needs to be made, which is that if you take the resources that are currently accredited in the summer and you add them on to what LREs have submitted for summer accredited capacity, you get up to 42% in SPP today. So this is, again, I think this is a sort of a stamp of approval of the level of capacity we have, and absolutely ensuring we don't go below that level of capacity. And it's just summary level here. Again, everything that was included. It does not include planned and maintenance outages, which is why the market monitoring unit took the position that they did, that it should be 37%. 50% incremental cold weather outage scenario, assuming that we've corrected half of the problems that we experienced during Winter Storm Uri. Shifting the winter risk to lower risk in the winter and higher in the summer. Or higher reliability in the winter and lower reliability in the summer, basically allowing the possibility of load shed to move into the summer. And then I'm not going to go over this too much, but this does go to show you here. So This is including planned and maintenance outages. This is not including planned and maintenance outages. And this is the level of incremental cold weather outages that you allow to affect the modeling results in the model. Okay, so the only way, and these are basically percentage of time of load loss occurring during the year. So basically, in order to comply with the tariff standard of 1 day of loss of load in 10 years, basically both of these have to add up to 0.1 or 0.1 day in a year. And so the MOPSI approved recommendation that was 3316, it only gets you to a FERC approved level of reliability if you assume equal amounts of risk in the winter and the summer, or equivalently, if you assume that a loss of load in the summer is equivalent to the loss of load in the summer, or a loss of load in the winter is equivalent to the loss of load in the summer from an economic and reliability and maybe public health perspective, public safety. If you say, no, we want to lower the level of risk in the winter to no more than 3 days in 10 years, and we'll accept 7 days or 7/10 of a day in 10 years. Sorry, 3/10 of a day out of 10 years for the winter and 7/10 of a day out of 10 years for the summer. Then in order to accomplish that, that's where you go from a 36 to a 16, 36 and 16 from 33 and 16. These are just all the factors that actually can push these numbers around. The actual result out of the modeling was here. You say, well, we've made a lot of improvements since Winter Storm Uri. You get down to 37. You take out any planned and maintenance outages during peak conditions, you get down to 36. These are the other factors that would push you up from lower levels. Again, that's in the packet, so you guys can look that over at your leisure. Okay, quickly, this is the base planning reserve margin and the ACAP planning reserve margin. Now, this is the 36% that we talked about. This is the one that the regional state committee actually has the authority over. In SPP, the states consisting of the regional state committee make the recommendation to the board of directors. The board can disagree with the states and file its own recommendation, but they don't. And then this is the ACAP PRM. Now, this is the one that will actually be used to determine enforcement and to actually determine compliance. This will be enforced on an individual resource level. And this ACAP PRM is the one that accounts for the decrementing of capacity for performance-based accreditation and fuel assurance policies. So I'm going to go through a quick example of how that would work. Okay, so these are real world numbers. Okay, the summation of the load responsible entities peak demand, 47,000 megawatts. That's real close to the level of peak demand we've already experienced in 2022 and 2023 with Winter Storms Elliott and Jerry. And we say we need a 36% planning reserve margin. So 65,000 megawatts of installed capacity. Again, this level of capacity exists within SPP today. And so now we account for the effects of performance-based accreditation and fuel assurance. And we basically decrement that installed capacity by almost 11 gigs. And so you see that down here. What that means is, okay, actually, we only have to have accredited capacity in the winter of 54,000 megawatts after accounting for how units actually perform. And so when the rubber meets the road, SPP and its enforcement capacity is going to ask, and FERC and the market monitor is going to say, individual load serving entity like Evergy or Sunflower, do you have a ACAP accredited capacity planning reserve margin? Do you have 13.1% ACAP PRM? If you don't, you're going to have to pay it's not a penalty necessarily. It's basically a payment to pay others that have better performance. If you have better better performance or you have excess capacity, then you'll get payments from those that don't. And so this is the mechanism that I was talking about, that, you know, what it's doing is it's getting more granular, it's getting more unit specific, more load resource specific, and saying, if you have units that perform better than others, then, you know, it's going to be that much easier for you to meet a 13.1%. But if your units perform worse than others, then it's going to be harder for you to meet that. And that is the alternative to just increasing this number to, say, 45% or 50%. And so it's like desocializing or deregionalizing the planning reserve margin impacts on individual utilities. Okay, a couple things from the joint stakeholder update. This is just a backlog mitigation progress slide. You know, this is the sort of thing that every chance SPP gets, every quarterly or monthly meeting, they provide an update on how are we doing clearing the backlog. The generation interconnection queue backlog started with 221,000 megawatts a few years ago. It's down to 84 gigawatts today. The vast majority of those are in, you know, one form of study or restudy. And they remind us that 25,000 megawatts of capacity now have signed interconnection agreements. Transmission capacity is available, yet this stuff has not come online. It's not reached commercial operation yet. This is an interesting slide I wanted to throw in here that shows, you know, the status of the generating units that want to connect to the transmission system and want to bring additional capacity online. Thankfully, and for the first time in several years, there are now, you know, 7,000 megawatts of thermal, conventional dispatchable generation that's in the queue. We will see this number grow for sure with the policies that are being put in place right now. There's quite a bit of solar, not as much wind, quite a bit of battery storage capacity, and then hybrid would be a combination between solar and battery or battery and wind. This is interesting. So it's not all, you know, doom and gloom necessarily with regard to the reliability issues that we're facing in this region and across the country right now. So there has been 2,900 additional megawatts of capacity that's been added in the 12 months ending July 1st, 2024. That coal, interestingly, 238 megawatts. I mean, the last time we built a coal plant in this country was in 2013. So that's obviously just a firm capacity delivery coming into the region from another region. But we did add almost 500 megawatts of additional gas, and you can see the other numbers there. Okay, wind penetration. This is just an interesting slide that came out of the joint stakeholder group, and you know, sort of tells a story that we've talked about many times in the past of, yeah, there's times when wind is a great resource in SPP and it serves the vast majority of load. And as a result, wholesale power prices are very low during that period of time. And then there are other times where there's almost no wind on the system. And we have, you know, almost no solar, utility scale solar in SPP right now, less than 500 megawatts online. There are plans to bring significantly more solar online in the next 2 or 3 years within SPP, but for now it's in this sort of other category. And you can see the dates and times. Just the operations and the market operations people of SPP provide a slide like this every quarter that just says, you know, what's the maximum and minimum wind penetration we experienced last year. Kind of, I think it appropriately keeps everybody's focus on the fact that there's a lot of other resources that are filling in the gaps when wind isn't there. Okay, this is just the board of directors meeting and the members committee meeting in terms of what was approved. We've already talked about RR 621 and 622 in terms of what was approved. And we'll just go to the other two substantive items. All of the costs of SPP administrative activities are recovered through a Schedule 1A administrative fee rate cap. This is uniformly charged to every megawatt hour of load throughout the 14 state region. There is a rate cap within the tariff that says it cannot go higher than this absent a waiver and FERC approval. Basically, they change this every 3 years. There was quite a bit of substantive discussion in the finance committee about the need to increase this. SPP's perspective is it's increasing less than we have on average for the last 20 years by 0.5 percentage point. Our revenue requirements growing significantly less than inflation over the last 6 years. This is an item that obviously will continue to be discussed pretty extensively in the stakeholder community. But at the end of the day, what it's going to, if FERC approves it, is 0.5 cents a megawatt hour. So that would be 0.005 cents maybe 0.0005 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just in case you did hear about this or will hear about this, the DISIS waivers that occurred, that stands for Definitive Interconnected Systems Impact Studies. The board of directors did approve a waiver of the 2024 DISIS study beginning. In other words, all the projects that entered the generation interconnection queue during 2024, the board has approved a delay of starting the study of those projects. And the reason they've done that is because there is a backlog mitigation plan that's occurring that's restudying generation interconnection queue projects from 2017 and 18 all the way to the current. The idea here is that instead of continuously reopening a new study for a generation interconnection queue and then restudying it several times over the next several years as generators drop out of that, as the reality that we do need, the transmission system is basically at capacity. If we want to add any additional generation, we're going to have to add transmission. Those costs are directly assigned to generators. They drop out of the study queue and then the whole thing restarts again. And this is an effort to basically, stop, give it a year, allow all of these previous restudies to occur, and then we'll study the 2024 and the 2025 generation interconnection queues. And ultimately, we'll get to the same place anyway at the same time, but we won't, bang our head against the wall and incur a lot of additional time and resources to do all these studies that ultimately are just going to have to be restudied anyway. This actually passed with unanimous approval at the stakeholders, the members committee meeting that reports to or advises the board of directors. So this was not it started off as a controversial decision, but at the end of the day, it was not controversial. I think everybody understood the logic for why this needs to happen. This is just a incredibly busy slide that basically demonstrates what I just talked about, which is that all of these red arrows are multiple restudies that are pending from 2022 and 2023, and actually from the backlog mitigation from 2017 up through 2022 or 2021. And so this is a 1-year sort of allow all of these other restudies to catch up so that when we do study the generation interconnection queue in 24 and 25, it'll actually be meaningful studies. Real quick, pending cost allocation issues. This is another incredibly important issue to the state of Kansas, something that we've been involved in since at least 2019 when Sherry served on the HIT team. This is HIT C1, and it's the effort of decoupling Schedule 9 and Schedule 11 and growing basically the cost allocation zones for byway facilities, those transmission facilities from 100 to 300 kilovolts. And instead of charging 2/3 of the cost of those facilities to just the zone that they happen to be located in, what this effort is attempting to do is to charge those types of facilities to the larger sub-regional area that the deliverability studies that SPP has performed have shown is that the megawatts that are produced by generators in those areas tend to flow to those larger areas. And so this is a critically important cost allocation reform with the state of Kansas, something we're really involved in and passionate about. And I actually think we're finally about there. I had a COG meeting on August 13th, and a straw poll was taken that does have majority support, and I think there's a chance that at least maybe 2 of those votes are going to going to shift before September. And so we're hopeful. We're crossing our fingers, but this is an important move for the state of Kansas. Here's the actual recommendation itself that received the straw poll. And then this is just a quick look at the map, which shows, if this passes going forward, a 115 kV line that's built out in Sunflower or Midwest service territory will actually be cost allocated across this entire central part of the region. And likewise, right, a line that's built down here, 115 kV line built down here, will be cost allocated across the region. This makes sense for a host of reasons, but probably maybe the most important reason is the deliverability studies that SPP has done, which basically confirm that power flows best through this central part of the region, power flows best through this northern part of the region, and power flows best through this southern part of the region. So more to come here. I hope to be able to report to everybody when I do this next report that this has actually passed the stakeholder process and is on its way towards RSC and board approval. And that's that. Sorry to rush as quickly as I had to at the end, but I did get done at 11:45. So sorry.
We rushed you. This fantastic update, Justin. Let's just ask at this time if Commissioner Keene or Commissioner Keither have any final questions.
I have no questions, but I do have a comment. First of all, thank you so much. It was an outstanding report. I appreciate so much the granularity and the detail that you're willing to discuss and to entertain my leading questions. The other thing I would offer, and I join with my fellow commissioners in this too, is I want to thank Commissioner Albrecht for her service to the state and to the commission, both during her term in office and after. She has distinguished herself repeatedly. And Sherry, we think the world of your efforts, and we thank you so much for what you've done. That's the extent of my comments. Thank you, Chair French.
Thank you, Commissioner Keither. Any questions?
I'm digesting.
Well, Justin is available to all of us at any
Right.
time, and I know he would be very happy to go through any of these in more detail, or even to zoom out and say, what are we doing here? What's the overall thrust of why we're pursuing this initiative, and why are we voting the way we are? I mean, the open meetings laws don't allow me to wander into your office and and give my take. But Justin and I talk very frequently, as did Sherry and I before, and Justin's going to be very happy to give you all the lowdown on the conversations and why we're taking the positions we are. I know I've said this before, but I'll say it again. With Sherry and now with Justin, Kansas is and remains one of, if not the most engaged states within the Southwest Power Pool process. We obviously devote resources to it. I mean, you can tell we're devoting Justin as a resource to it. You know how important he is to everything we do. So we will remain that way, and we will be very engaged in all of these important topics as they are important, and they're becoming even more important as we move forward. So with that, Justin, thank you so much for the presentation. We'll look forward to the next quarterly presentation next time. We have come to the conclusion of everything on today's agenda, and I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. We're adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.